Good evening, everybody. My name is, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. I'm also the director of the McLean Hospital Spirituality and Mental Health Program in Belmont, Massachusetts. In addition to that work, and this work here in Boston, broadcasting from my home this evening, I'm also the founder and director of a clinical program in the New York area called the Center for Anxiety. Centerforanxiety.org is the URL. And we do work with 3 offices in the New York area, in Manhattan, and in Brooklyn, and in Rockland County. And in the Rockland County and Brooklyn offices, we service a lot of individuals from the Orthodox Jewish community. That's not the entire focus of our work there, but we are geographically situated to be able to do so. Professionally, those are my main gigs. And I'm also a board-certified clinical psychologist. I'm licensed in 3 states, here in Massachusetts and in New York and also New Jersey. I've written about 50 peer-reviewed publications. Most of them on the subject of spirituality and mental health from a research standpoint. Many of them, almost all of them, empirical articles. I'm also the author of a recent book on spirituality and cognitive therapy, a guide for clinicians, which is out with Guilford Press. My research is, it's been featured in different media outlets, in ABC and NPR, Scientific American, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times have picked up my work. Typically somebody else introduces me. It's a bit uncomfortable for me to do so, frankly, but I was told very clearly that I had to share who I am before I talk about this sensitive topic tonight. So I mentioned it already that my area of research is spirituality and religion and mental health, and I study them as a clinical scientist. I've been doing that for about 15 years. Frankly, I've tried to stay away from the topic of sexual abuse. The reason is, excuse me, is because it's charged. It's a charged topic. And despite being encouraged by many of my colleagues for a number of years to be able to do work in this area, I've really stayed away from it. Oh, and I see some people are already asking questions, and that's great. Please ask your questions, and I'll get to them once I've finished the beginning of my presentation. Anyhow, I stayed away from the subject because I was really just focused on spiritual and religious issues as they relate to mental health. Are they a buffer? Do they protect people against anxiety and depression and the like? Can they potentially make situations worse? The answer to that question, by the way, is both. Can be both positive and negative, but that's not the focus of today. Anyhow, like I said, I stayed away from this topic until a close colleague of mine pitched me with this idea of doing a study on how spiritual and religious life might be relevant to the emotional lives of people who have had sexual abuse. And I said, that's interesting. That's an interesting topic. Maybe spirituality could be helpful. Maybe it could be harmful for people who have had sexual abuse histories. And maybe it might be affected by a sexual abuse history, or maybe not. And these are all the questions that were really interesting to me. And an opportunity came up to study this. It actually dropped right into my lap. And I'll explain how it came about. Maybe I'll tell you a bit about that now. A couple of years ago, I started a 3-year independently funded study on spirituality and mental health in the Jewish community, not just the Orthodox community, in the Jewish community. And we had significant funding, philanthropically funded, to be able to do this study, and recruited nearly 500 people from the United States and Canada, Jewish individuals, who we followed over a 3-year period. And in the context of that larger study, which was just about spirituality and mental health in the Jewish community, we were able to study the question of sexual abuse. I'll tell you a little bit more about the methodology later, but that's the basics of it, at least for now. I want to go over the main findings of the study before talking about the methodology. Typically in the scientific world, we don't do that. We talk about the methods first, we talk about the findings, but given the nature of our forum today, I know a lot of people want to hear what we found. So I'll report that to you now. The overall, and the findings can be, they are available there's a full-length text of our paper, which is here, which was published in Child Abuse and Neglect, a journal which focuses on the subject earlier this year. The title of the study is Childhood Sexual Abuse, Mental Health, and Religion Across the Jewish Community, and it was just published in May, I think it is. It's a 2018 paper. For those of you who have a science background and you want to read it, you can get at least the abstract online, and if you'd like a copy of it, then you're welcome to get in touch. Anyhow, overall, what we found was kind of a bit shocking. We found that overall 1/6 of males, 1 in 6 males, and 1 in 4 females reported childhood sexual abuse. This is in the Jewish community. And yes, I'll define who was included in that. Reported childhood sexual abuse that actually involved inappropriate contact of the genitals. So serious, if you will, sexual abuse. Not that anything else isn't serious. Of course, it can be very serious. But from a scientific perspective, at least objectively speaking, somebody endorsing that, it's certainly problematic. Those levels are approximately equivalent to the national levels that we see in national studies. However, what we found was about 4 times as much, nearly 5 times as much, in fact, prevalence of abuse among individuals who were once Orthodox and have left Orthodoxy. Formerly Orthodox Jews who were raised Orthodox and then left. The other religious groups that we found in our study were actually equivalent. There were Orthodox Jews who were either Hasidic, that is, or they were from the Yeshiva Orthodox camp. Some of them were modern Orthodox, some of them were raised Orthodox, and some of them were raised non-Orthodox. Okay, so some of them were termed as Balei Tshuva, people who were not raised non-Orthodox and then came into the fold of Orthodoxy. All those groups, and also non-Orthodox Jews, people who were never Orthodox and still are not. I don't mean formerly Orthodox who are non-Orthodox. Non-Orthodox Jews who never were had the same levels of abuse across the board. And interestingly, which is not surprising, people who had childhood sexual abuse compared to individuals who did not had substantially greater risk of a psychiatric disorder. They had more psychological distress. But what was really interesting was that they also had lower levels of religious belief and lower levels of religious practice. And it wasn't because Orthodox Jews were less likely than non-Orthodox Jews. Even within these groups, people who had a sexual abuse history relative to their same group peers were less likely to have religious belief and religious practice. Plus, we found that striking finding of the extremely high odds ratio individuals who were formerly Orthodox relative to everyone else. So that was really a key finding. Another finding, though, which was interesting, I think, is that across the board, higher levels of religious and spiritual involvement and practice, they were associated with lower odds of having a psychiatric diagnosis. And they were also associated with lower levels of psychological distress on a continuous scale in terms of depression, in terms of anxiety. And that was really across the board as well, independent of people's affiliation. And those are some of the main findings. I want to talk about the methodology. And I see some questions coming in now about the tables. I think I'll be able to get into that. It shouldn't be a problem, but I just wanted to cover the main findings first, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty during Q&A if people want. In terms of methods, again, this is a larger multi-year study on Judaism and mental health. We did not mention sexuality and certainly not sexual abuse in any of the recruitment materials for the study. Rather, we recruited participants for a study on aspects of their spiritual lives and aspects of their mental health. And mental health included anxiety and depression and psychotic disorders and eating disorders and OCD. It included family functioning. It even included people's utilization of dental care. I mean, there was everything. Almost the kitchen sink was almost in there, as well as a couple of items on sexual abuse, another aspect of human psychology and psychological functioning. We think that this method was key, and I want to be clear. The purpose of the parent study was not just to study sexual abuse. That was not my goal. That's not my area of research entirely. I mean, now it is because we published this paper and there's a lot of interest in this. But it's not my main area of focus. My main area of focus is how is spirituality relevant to mental health. But in the context of that, we assessed for sexual abuse alongside these many other variables. And I think the method here is important. In the past, there have been other researchers who specifically recruited individuals who have a sexual abuse background. About 10 years ago, there was a group of individuals who were in the New York area. It was actually a well received by the scientific community, the study. But in terms of the cultural sensitivity of their approach, I took exception to them in that they recruited individuals from mikvahs, and from OBG offices by specifically targeting individuals who have had sexual abuse and putting up signs and saying we're studying this topic. And I have very little doubt that a selective group of individuals was recruited for their study. And that's just not the case with us, because we didn't recruit for people based on such a sensitive topic, an extremely sensitive topic, especially in the Orthodox world. And our findings were different from that group in some regards, and I think it was because of their method. In any event, another aspect of what we did, this is important. We only assessed for childhood sexual abuse in the 5th wave of the study. The waves were done every 6 months. So one at the beginning, and then 6 months later, at 1 year, a year and a half, and then at 2 years. So after 2 full years of involvement in the study, 2.5 even, these individuals were being assessed for in terms of their sexual abuse. We had a high degree of trust among our participants because they had been working with us for 2 years. But it was nevertheless an anonymous study. We had a pretty cool method of doing this. That the whole thing was done online, and individuals were able to create a username and a password to be able to log into the study and complete them. They received email, but the email could have been set up to an alias email address, which was not really their own. So no identifying. They could identify if they wanted to, but there was no pressure to identify who these people were. So we had an anonymous survey, literally an anonymous survey done, which protected people's privacy, and we assessed for it in this way. There's another aspect of our methods which is important. We collaborated with Jewish organizations from the entire gamut of the Jewish world. I was actually surprised. When I told my colleagues in the Jewish world about this, that this is what I wanted to do, they said, that's just not going to happen. How are you going to get people from the left, from the right, from the center, everybody to be able to participate? And thank God they were wrong. Individuals from the organizations from the ultra-Orthodox, such as the Agudas Yisrael, they sent out emails recruiting people for this study. Centrist Orthodox organizations, the OU and Yeshiva University sent out information. The United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism and the Union of Reform Judaism were extremely helpful to me. They disseminated this to rabbis throughout the country, the United States and Canada, who then disseminated it onto their congregations. And I'm very grateful to them for their assistance. In addition, we contacted organizations which are really specialty organizations, which service select groups of individuals. Some of them are Aish Torah and Or Sameach, which serve as individuals who were once not Orthodox and now are coming back or have come back to Orthodoxy. And another group that was very helpful to us was Footsteps. Footsteps sent out information about this study to its constituents, to a number of constituents. And from there, the information carried throughout using social media and otherwise. We initially recruited 402 people for the study. That was at wave 1. It wasn't 500 before, it was 402, pardon me. And by wave 5, there's some attrition, which just makes sense over time. We still had 372 people. So you can see our high retention rate was more than 90%. I mean, it's a very high retention rate. These participants, we still have a relationship, if you will, with them today. The age range from 18 to 83. The mean was about 37, and the standard deviation was 15. So about 65% of the sample was between 22 and 52. 70% were female, 50% married, 76% college educated, not entirely surprising. And when we checked out, did dropouts have any demographic differences between the people who remained in the study, the answer was no. There were no statistical differences. In terms of the sample, we were able to recruit a religiously diverse sample across 4 groups. The 4 groups were as follows. Number 1, there were people who were always Orthodox. They were raised Orthodox and currently they remain Orthodox. That was 100 individuals in the study, excuse me. The second group were formerly non-Orthodox. These are Bali Tshuva, and that was 98 people, about the same number. Then we had the third group was people who were never Orthodox, not currently and never were, 138 people, a really nice chunk of people, which was great. And the fourth group was a smaller group, but nevertheless adequately powered, so it was statistically adequately enough of a sample to power our analyses, which was 36 individuals who were once Orthodox and then had left. Now, in terms of what the main findings mean, we've known for a long time that history of sexual abuse can predict emotional distress. Now, our findings suggest that history of childhood sexual abuse not only can impact people's emotional states, but also their religious development. Now, why might that occur? Well, there are a couple of possibilities. The one, which is a really fascinating possibility, and I don't know of any other research which substantiates this, but it's nevertheless an important consideration and something definitely worthy of researching in the future, which is that it could be that sexuality and religion are actually intrinsically related to each other. It could be that they're both forms of connection, the one being primarily interpersonal and perhaps having a spiritual dimension to it, but primarily interpersonal, and religion having more of a direct spiritual connection, if one will. And it could be, therefore, that aspects of sexual abuse are actually intrinsically tied to aspects of struggling in the spiritual domain. There are ways to do that kind of research, and I think it would be important to be done. Another possibility, though, is that there are psychologically mediated effects. It could be that people who have childhood sexual abuse, they become more struggling with their spirituality. It could be that they ask the question, why did God do this to me? How could such a terrible thing happen? Is there really rhyme and reason and order in the universe? And all of those are very normative, even healthy questions for individuals who have had an abuse history to be asking. And it could be that those questions, that they're not resolved, or when they're not resolved, lead to spiritual and religious decline. So there could be psychologically mediated or focused ways in which people's abuse impacts the way that they're thinking and feeling about their religion, and then that leads to changes. A third possibility, though, which I think is probably the most likely, is that there are socially mediated effects. It could be that when, oh, I see, whoever just made this comment, when the abuse is handled correctly versus being covered up, whoever made that comment knows exactly what I'm about to say. That when there are socially mediated effects, it could be that when religious communities don't handle in a healthy way, in an emotionally supportive way, a way of supporting victims, if religious institutions are preserved at the expense of individual psychological needs, it could be that those individuals who aren't having their emotional needs met have subsequent falling out from their religious community. And I think that's the most likely scenario, but it's probably all three, frankly. And I think these are really important questions, research questions that the research community needs to address. I was surprised that I don't know of any other studies that have looked at this religious sequelae, the religious consequences of sexual abuse. And I think they're very important because of the next thing I'm about to say. Now, it's also been known for a long time that spirituality can buffer against emotional distress. Spirituality is a very powerful force, for positive and negative. On the psychological front, the majority of research rather shows positive effects and shows that it can help people to have more meaning, more purpose, to be centered, to have a sense that things happen for a reason, to be connected to something, to not feel that people are alone. And there are clear buffering effects against depression. It's a very large literature showing a buffering effect, a protective effect that is against depression, against substance abuse, a very strong literature on that, substance abuse and alcohol abuse. People who have religion and spirituality in their lives are much less likely to engage in substance abuse, and also in suicidality. People who have religion and spirituality are less likely to have suicidal thoughts, engage in suicidal behaviors, and complete suicide. And those are strong findings from national studies that have been done. But nevertheless, we haven't really examined whether there are specific effects among sexual abuse survivors in this domain. In our study, religious beliefs and practices were associated with less anxiety, less depression, and lower odds of a psychiatric diagnosis overall. And that was the same among survivors of sexual abuse. Even though they were less likely to have religion and spirituality in their lives, to the extent that they had that spirituality, that focus, that belief, that sense of purpose, of spiritual purpose, and spiritual striving and engagement in behavior, to the extent that they had that, they were protected against psychiatric diagnoses and anxiety and depression, even if that the people who had a sexual abuse history and people who did not. So if you think about it, the religious consequences of sexual abuse that we seem to have discovered in some way, it's really a tragedy, because in many ways, individuals are they're becoming more distant from a resource that could help them to move forward and help them to heal. It could be a salve for many people to help them to move forward. And I want to be clear, not everybody uses spirituality to cope with distress. But when people do, it can really help. And if people are more distant from that because of something that happened to them, it's almost like a double whammy. It's very sad and very tragic. I want to make a main conclusion here, an important point, and then I guess we'll go to Q&A. So please write in your questions. Most writing about religion and sexual abuse has been finger pointing. And this is one of the reasons why I never got into this area. I don't want to point fingers. I'm a scientist, I'm a clinician, I like to help people, I like to discover the truth. I'm not here to point fingers at people about cover-ups and the need for reporting. All of that is extremely important. Don't get me wrong. It's extremely important, and I'm grateful to the individuals out there who have pushed this agenda forward. Okay, I'm getting lots of things. I got some thumbs up for that comment. I'm very grateful to the people who have pushed that agenda forward. But I think that we're at a place of history that we have to start thinking about not only what communities need to do in terms of reporting, but the experience of the victims. What are their needs? What are their psychological needs? And what are their spiritual needs? the reality is that childhood sexual abuse, it's not only a community problem, it's a problem for individuals. It leaves so many scars. It leaves religious communities need to be better prepared in order to deal with things at a macro level, but we also have to be prepared to deal with the victims one by one. The people who have experienced childhood sexual abuse, their religious experience, their psychological experience, the pain that they are carrying around. And what we have to do is be more compassionate and more inclusive. I was just thinking about this study and a couple of cases that I've seen where I've had patients who had religious decline after experiencing sexual abuse, really like the study said. And they went to school, they went to religious parochial school, and they were asking questions. Why do bad things happen to good people? How do we know that all these aspects of God are correct that you're telling me? And they were just asking basic religious questions to them, which were like coming from a place of pain. And the response that they received from their teachers was, we don't ask questions like that. Those aren't the kind of things that we should speak about here in class. And they realized right away that they were not going to receive validation. They became disconnected from their teachers, from their communities, and from their faith. And as a result, there was more damage which set in. And I think that we need to be inclusive when teens and kids especially raise religious questions, because who knows where it's coming from. When people are struggling with their faith, we need to validate that. And I'm not saying that all spiritual struggles come from a place of pain, okay? There are questions that people just have, and frankly, those need to be validated too. But the point is that we definitely need to be much more compassionate and support individuals instead of ostracizing them when they're exhibiting religious differences. And that I think is in some ways the main conclusion of my point. Okay, so I see there's some submitted questions. I guess I will go in order from the top. So one person said, since Agudas Yisrael collaborated in the study, has there been any feedback from them about the results? No, people don't know about this yet in the mainstream world. I mean, the study was only published in May. And things from bench to press is 2 years in the scientific world, and getting the information out into the Jewish community, I hope it doesn't take another 2 years, but it might take longer. There's a point here about stated policies. I don't know. I'm not interested. I don't know. I just don't know what they do or what any other of these groups do. Again, this is not an area of activism for me. I'm coming as a scientist, and I know the literature now and the data that I have. And however this is helpful to the community in getting the word out and promoting the importance of taking care of individuals who have been afflicted by this, it would be an honor and a pleasure. And I'm happy to support those efforts any way I can in my limited capacity. Okay. Can you at some point go through the numbers in table 2, prevalence? Sure. I don't know how many people who are watching have a copy of the paper, but I will go through it. Okay, table 2, this is on page 25 of the study. It's not 25 pages long, don't worry. It's on page 25 of the journal, which is like 4 or 5 pages in. Okay, so here we have, at the top, we have males, and the bottom we have females. And then we have the 4 groups that I mentioned. We have always Orthodox, formerly Orthodox, never Orthodox, and I'm sorry. We have 4 groups: always Orthodox, formerly non-Orthodox, so Bali Tshuva, never Orthodox, and formerly Orthodox, who were once Orthodox and now have left. And I mean, it's pretty straightforward, actually. What you have here is the prevalence of sexual abuse among each of these groups. So I don't know if I want to read through all, you probably don't want me to read through a whole series of numbers here, but the main point is that if you look at the formerly Orthodox, what we found was any abuse was reported by 45% of the females and 32% of the males. So one in three, and nearly 1 in 2 formerly Orthodox. Shocking. Very, very high numbers. Anyhow, another person said, actually it's the same person, is there any data on how religious observance of belief is affected in situations when abuse is handled correctly versus not being covered up? That's a great follow-up study. What are the mediating factors? How is it that that changes in spirituality follow the experience of sexual abuse? Is it a socially mediated factor like I was speaking about? Is it psychologically mediated? Or is there a direct effect, or is it all three? These are really good follow-up questions to be studied by my colleagues. Someone said, so it's not the smartphones, for real. Could this, okay, very funny, very funny. Someone asked, is the paper available online? It's available online if you have an academic subscription. I'm happy to send it out to people if people get in touch. My research assistant often gets requests for it. If it gets to be a lot of them, I can talk to Jewish Community Watch about a way of disseminating it. Okay, somebody asked the question that the association between formerly Orthodox and unwanted sex was weak. And there's a question about multiple comparisons, which is an astute question. That person's obviously a researcher. If I'm not mistaken, for our chi-squares, it wasn't that weak. It was strong enough. I'd have to look into it. That's more of a sophisticated question. I will tell you this went through some pretty rigorous peer review, and no one raised the issue of multiple comparisons in our review. If I'm not mistaken, we employed a correction or we combined the analyses. So I have to look more carefully at the paper. Frankly, it's been a little while since I really dove into that. But thank you for your question. Can you tell us where this is published? Sure, I mentioned this before. The journal is called Child Abuse and Neglect. You know what I can do? I can post to Jewish Community Watch a copy of the link to the study, and that will give people a link to the journal. Okay, I'm not sure if there are any more questions. I'm happy to try to field any. You know what, there are a couple questions that were submitted beforehand, so I'll just read those. One person asked, did the study differentiate between being abused by a relative for incest and by others outside the family? And no, we did not. And that's a really excellent question. Which forms of abuse might have more of a pernicious effect, be problematic for religious development and also for mental health? There's an anecdote here, which I won't read, but it's very, very striking. And whoever sent this to me, thank you very much. Somebody wrote, how could it be otherwise? Kids are taught certain things about religious life, and then they're seduced or forced to experiences that are the opposite, about an authority figure who keeps teaching publicly the opposite. I agree with you. I think that, it makes sense. These findings make sense, but you never know unless you do the research, right? You never know. Maybe it could be differently, and that's the reason that we spend time and money doing these kinds of studies. Okay, so with that, I will sign off, and thank you very much for joining. And I really hope that this study will not only help our community to deal with it at the macro level, again, like I was saying before, but to have more compassion and inclusion for victims and for individuals who are struggling with their faith. Thank you very much.